thanks for all coming out on such a beautiful evening. I'm just going to start talking and try to get everyone calm and in place. Rebecca and Stephen are going to wander up here and take a seat in just a second. But I'm Becky Dayton, and I'm from the Vermont Book Shop, and we, together with the Makai Theater, are the hosts of this evening's celebration of books and community. I'd like to thank Ben Wills and Justin Arsenault of the Makai Theater for generously giving us this space tonight. We all agree that collaboration is a beautiful thing, and I hope that you'll help me help out the theater by having a drink and something to eat. And it looks like everyone has done that, so that's great. This is meant to be a really lively gathering, so please feel free to get up and wander about if you need to. I'd like to thank my former bookselling colleague, Josie Levitt, who used to be a partner at the Flying Pig Bookstore in Shelburne, which is Stephen's closest bookshop. Josie helped promote this event to the LGBT community in Vermont through her work at the Pride Center, who's benefiting from this evening. I'm donating $1 for every hardcover book sold of this title over the course of its life to Pride to support the work that they do as a community. I hope that if you're interested in LGBTQ issues that you'll look them up at pridecenterbt.org. Obviously, books are for sale here tonight, right here in the lobby. My colleague Jenny should be here any second now to sell you a copy or three of Rebecca's amazing new novel, as well as what we call in publishing the backlist. So her first two novels and her book of short stories. Rebecca will be available after the conversation to sign and grab the books for you. This is truly a remarkable book that I think will dazzle any fan of good contemporary literary fiction. Just a gentle reminder that we, your local independent bookstore, have to actually sell books in order to remain here on Main Street. So your business is crucial to maintaining the vibrancy of our small and increasingly vulnerable downtown. If you value us, please don't leave it up to other people to support us. Now, so everyone turn off the ringers on your phone, because we don't need that noise in addition to whatever's going to come from the theater next door. It's an honor to present to you tonight not just one, but two of my favorite authors, and folks that I consider my friends as well, Rebecca Makkai and Stephen Kiernan. I asked Stephen here tonight to be in conversation with Rebecca because he's a good talker and I'm not, and because he's also a terrific novelist and journalist, as well as a student of history and our healthcare system, which features in this book. A winner of the George Polk Award in Journalism, Stephen is the author of 2 books of nonfiction, Authentic Patriotism and Last Rites, and 3 novels, The Curiosity, The Hummingbird, and The Baker's Secret, all of which are available at the Vermont Book Shop. A graduate of Middlebury College, Stephen holds an MA from Johns Hopkins University and an MFA from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, and Stephen lives in Charlotte. Thanks for being here, Stephen.
Party down.
Our guest of honor is Rebecca Makkai. She's the author of 3 novels, The Great Believers, The 100-Year House, and The Borrower, as well as a short story collection entitled Music for Wartime. Her short fiction won a 2017 Pushcart Prize and was included in the Best American Short Story Collection 4 years running. She's a recipient of a 2014 NEA Fellowship and is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University. She is also the artistic director of Story Studio Chicago, all this, and she has 2 beautiful young daughters, and I don't know how she does all of that, but they are as precocious and talented as she is. I'll leave it to Rebecca to tell you herself about the excitement of getting a glowing front page review in the New York Times Book Review 2 weeks ago. Being interviewed just this week by Joe Donahue on WAMC, is that right? Or was it just
April.
posted? Okay.
Well, no,
Okay.
I can't remember anything.
And booked on Late Night with Seth Meyers on
The 23rd.
July 23rd. So set your PVRs, because that's going to be a good one. And my 2 cents, this is one of the finest novels of 2018. I feel that very strongly, and I'm just thrilled to be hosting Rebecca Makkai here for the Vermont Book Shop in Little Middlebury. So I think you're all very privileged to be here, and thank you for coming. All right.
So I'm going to take the liberty of greeting you because I'm not going to do very much talking. What I'm hoping is that all of you will drink enough that that pretty soon I'll stop talking altogether. I prepared 9 questions, and it's my fervent hope that I get through half of that, and then you folks take over. And you know, Grace and Liz, there's some seats here, and there's a couple right here. If you want to try. Carolyn, come in.
If you bring the mic closer to your face, you'll actually be.
I didn't know if this was a TV mic or if this was a hear me clearly mic. Oh, never mind about me not talking. Yeah, exactly. It all started in a 50-watt radio station. Anyway, one of the great benefits of Becky asking me to do this is that I had the opportunity to read the book in advance. And it slaughtered me. It's absolutely fantastic. There is something funny on every page, and there's something to break your heart on every page. And it's one of those books where you get to about here in it, and you just start saying, please don't end, please don't end. And the closer you get, it's just like, no, this is so fantastic. And I'm not the only person who feels that way, because, as we heard mentioned, the New York Times did notice this and put it on the front of the book review, and I'll just read a couple of embarrassing passages. Let's see. She has borne unblinking witness to history, into a horrific episode already in danger among Americans, that is, of becoming a horror story out of the past, although more than 1 million people in this country are still infected with HIV. It's an antidote to our general urge to forget what we'd rather not remember, but it's also, which is more important, an absorbing and emotionally riveting story about what it's like to live during times of crisis. And who among us believes that at any point in the near future, we'll cease living in times of crisis? So it's a very, very powerful story that is populated by very much vivid, believable characters who you fall in love with for all their strengths and weaknesses. And I want to get back to, I just want to start with sort of basics. So the first question I have is, we have a story about AIDS in Chicago in the 1980s, and then a contemporary story as well. What gave you the idea? And the second part of that is, why is now a time to revisit that?
Yeah, the idea was not there, actually, when I started really thinking about it. I didn't start with either of those storylines. I started with what's now a subplot in the 1980s section, which is about this woman who'd been sort of an artist's muse and model in 1920s Paris. And that's what I set out to write about. I was doing some math and kind of figured she couldn't have lived much past the 1980s. So I had her in the 1980s, looking back at her life, trying to donate these pieces that she had to some kind of art guy. I didn't really know much yet about what was going on. And then I felt like, okay, I have an art guy in the 80s. I've been really interested in writing about the AIDS epidemic for a while. Maybe that would be a subplot or the background in some way. And before I actually started writing, this was about 6 months of thinking about it, the gravity shifted and that became really the novel. And that artist's muse became the subplot. She's still there, but she's 5% of the story now, if that. So that came first, and then the Paris part came later. What was really compelling to me was the parallels between what we think of often as the lost generation in Paris after World War I and the AIDS generation in a major American city in the 80s and then going onwards. We tend to think about, in Paris, the writers from America who got there after the war. We know about Fitzgerald and Hemingway. Actually, before World War I, Paris in particular is a mecca, of course, for visual artists. This is really the first time that people were coming from all over Europe, all over the world, in fact, from small towns, from everywhere, to get educated in the arts in Paris. So we have Modigliani, Soutine, Fujita, all these people. Coming to Paris, it's this artistic mecca, finding chosen family there, young men primarily. And then World War I rolls through and decimates that generation. The influenza also, of course, takes more lives than World War I. And it's after the war, as they're regrouping and as the Americans are kind of landing there too, that Gertrude Stein says to Hemingway, "You all are a lost generation." And the parallels for me between that and the generation that had come to major American cities like Chicago in the 70s and the 80s, post-Stonewall, finding, again, chosen family in this sort of urban mecca, many of them working in the arts, certainly not everyone, finally, finding a place, and then AIDS bulldozes through. And not only that, but the aftermath of that, what happens after 96, after the good drugs come out, as people are trying to continue lives they didn't think they could continue, trying to put lives back together, and what are the after effects of that. So that parallel was really fascinating to me and became the early core of the book, although we went in a lot of directions from there. And it's one of the things that led me to wanting to write about this time period 30 years later, wanting to write about 2015 to show not just what's happening then, but what does 30 years of aftermath look like? What is it like to be the only one left of your particular friend group that you had in your 20s? So that was it, and I think the second part of your question was why it's important now, and I think it's always important to be talking about this. As the piece of that book review that you quoted makes it clear, there are 1 million Americans living with HIV. There are also over 1 million people dying yearly of AIDS globally. Most of them are in Africa, which is one of the reasons that it's not on our conscience, I was going to say, I'm trying to say consciousness, but conscience works too, as much as it ought to be. But it's not just, people keep talking about, there are parallels to healthcare today, and but it's also literally still happening. And, literally in December, Trump goes and dissolves fires the remaining members of the HIV/AIDS Advisory Council. That just happened, despite 1 million Americans living with HIV. So this is, there are both, I think, there's the fact that it's still actually literally happening, and then there are always going to be parallels in terms of the way that people with power will abuse that power to commit very slow genocide against marginalized groups by denying health care and in a million other ways. That's something that we can't ever take our eyes off.
So a thing that's great, a thing I want to say just having read it is that this book is not a polemic. It's
I just got super political and made it sound
it's all right. But the reason that I want to make the distinction is not that so much as because of what art can do that is different from a polemic or from political stuff. I'm not going to give a lot away, but I'll just tell you that the opening scene is a party that is happening because a man has died, a young man has died, and his family doesn't want anyone coming to the memorial service. And there's a slideshow that they're all watching. And one person is there, this character named Yale, and he sees the slideshow, and people are drinking, and there's kind of celebration atmosphere, and he's just not feeling that way at all. He's not feeling like partying. He doesn't want to see a slideshow. He's really sad. So he goes upstairs for a while, and when he comes downstairs, everyone is gone. Now, it's later explained why everyone left this party, but he comes down, and everyone is gone. And it is absolutely chilling, because art is saying, there's the generation that will be lost. All of these young men will be gone. And so there's a moment of kind of premonition, of foreboding there that is fantastic. And at that point, you're in. The book has hooked you. Because it's not like you want to see the disaster, but you want to see who survives and how much love takes care of these people, because they're going to need a lot of love to take care of each other. So it's kind of an important distinction. I want to back up for a second when you talk about the process, because if you start with, we're going to be talking about painters in France in the 1900s, 1910, 1920s, and suddenly this is going to become about AIDS in Chicago. There's a research job,
yes.
Right? And can you tell me about how you did that, and were you reading and writing at the same time? Were you interviewing? How did you get comfortable and knowledgeable about that?
Yeah. This is something I love to talk about, I think, in part because I don't think that many people understand the amount of research that goes into fiction. Certainly some works more than others. But this is by far the most research heavy thing I've written. I needed, I made the decision early on to be writing about a real city. I'm not just going to make up a city. I'm going to write about Chicago. And if I'm going to write about Chicago, that means I'm writing about real events, real institutions, real bars, real, everything. Only a few little areas where I fictionalized. I really reinvented the gay press scene in Chicago, so I wasn't writing about individual people. And I renamed the art gallery at Northwestern because some untoward things happened there. And being employed by Northwestern University, I didn't really want to imply that it was the director of the Block Museum in the 1980s, so I renamed it. That's, then not only do I have the onus of, okay, I'm writing about real events, I have to get that right, but also I have no right to be writing about this. I'm writing across difference. There's a tremendous burden that comes with that, as there should be. You're not going to do that unless you are going to, I'm trying, the expression I use, I can't use because my kids are in the room, work your rear end off to really
Let's digress with that for a second, okay? In this way.
Yeah.
There's a line of critical thinking that says that, I know this because all my novels, women are narrators. And so I get this question all the time. Not only do you have a male narrator, but it's a gay male in the 1980s. In that, there's a line of critical thought that says that's an appropriation on your part, right? So I have like my dukes up ready for this anyway. But tell me about how you answer that.
Yeah, no. I felt like in order to proceed, because there were several times where I stopped and went, "What am I doing? I should stop." And what I really asked myself, I felt like the two questions I needed to be able to answer satisfactorily in order to proceed were, first of all, can I do this well? And it's not up to me to say whether I did, but to myself, my answer was, I think that I can do this well with the appropriate amount of research, with enough empathy, writing against stereotype, getting people to read it early on who are going to tell me when it feels off. And the other question was, would publishing this amplify more direct accounts, first-person accounts of that time, or LGBTQ voices, or could publishing this amplify those voices? Wait, did I say mute? I don't know if I just said the same thing twice, but would publishing this mute those voices, or could it amplify those voices? For that, ultimately my answer was, and I've seen this borne out, publishing this could help me draw attention to those first-person accounts, help me draw attention to either historical record, nonfiction, or works of art by people who lived through this time, whether it's visual art, literature, whatever. The hope being that if my book is the first thing someone has read about HIV/AIDS or about HIV/AIDS in Chicago, that it's not the last. The way publishing works, a press is much more likely to put money behind a project next year the more successful my book is. The press is not going to look at a book that comes out next year that's a first person, a personal account, and say that's already been done. They're much more likely to say, okay, we did this last year, or this other press did it last year with this book, and it sold, so this is a solid investment. Even 10 years ago, it was really hard for mainstream presses to feel like they would have a mainstream audience for books with LGBTQ subject matter. Those were shunted off to niche presses. There were, for a long time, niche bookstores even for those books. And within the past few years, the success of authors like Garth Greenwell, Rabia Al-Madin, straight authors like Hanya Yanagihara writing A Little Life, writing about LGBTQ issues, the success of those books has enabled the success of my book in many ways. My publisher was much more willing to see this as a mainstream book that your aunt's book club would be into. And any success of my book is going to help that cause as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm all over the place trying to direct people to other if you read my author's note particularly,
Yep.
trying to direct people to a lot of direct accounts.
So let's go back to the research for a second
Yeah.
and ask, what was a surprise for you? What was something you found in the research that you completely did not expect?
Yeah. I'll give you two very different things, and then to fill in a little bit here really quickly, because you'd asked me just how I went about the research. There was next to nothing in book form about HIV/AIDS in Chicago specifically. Third biggest city in the country. There's very little out there because the big nonfiction books, the big documentaries, all that stuff is about San Francisco or New York. Maybe about Paris and London, maybe about LA. But looking at a book like How to Survive a Plague by David France, which is a very important book, Chicago's not even in the index. So then I was thinking, well, surely someone had a doctoral dissertation or something that was turned into a book just on Chicago. There's nothing. I looked for 5 years. I can pretty confidently say there's nothing. So I was holding up in the library reading back issues of the Windy City Times, which is kind of the biggest gay weekly in Chicago. I read every issue from 1985 to 1992. Really interesting. The ads, and it was really wild. And then I did a lot of personal interviews, hours and hours of, with survivors, but doctors, nurses, activists, lawyers, journalists, historians, etc. So I'll give you two different things that surprised me. One was, it's just a detail thing. This is more, I guess this is more a story of me being dumb than a story of something really surprising, but that scene that you just referenced of Yale coming down to the party and his friends are gone, this is the first chapter, and then we skip to Paris, and then the third chapter, he's walking through the city looking for his friends, and he's walking down Halsted, which is kind of the main drag in Chicago for the gay bars, and he's looking in the windows of these gay bars to try to find his friends. You could not look through the window of a gay bar in 1985. It's not a thing. Which I fortunately caught early. I was talking to a friend who was one of these people I interviewed, and he was, I specifically said, talk to me, give me everything you can about the bar scene. And he's talking about this whole elaborate ritual with matchbooks, so that people would drop matchbooks in each other's laps with numbers, all these little details. And he mentions all the windows being painted black or blacked out or curtained off, and I was like, of course they would be. But that was, one of the many reasons it was so important that I be doing the research. I couldn't just empathize my way to that conclusion. It's not. I think, honestly, for me, that wasn't so much about writing from a straight female perspective as writing from now. These are bars I've been to. You can look in their windows now. And I've given that detail to gay friends closer in age to me, and they've taken a minute and go like, oh yeah, you're right. Like, not necessarily something, it was more, the era. The other thing I'll say that surprised me, this was more of a philosophical, psychological thing. Everyone I talked to, all of the gay men of a certain age to whom I spoke, I asked all of them, why do you think you're still here? That may sound like a horribly insensitive question. This is after we've become very close usually, and this is not, but why do you think? And what was really interesting to me is that nobody gave me a medical explanation. Nobody said I have strong immunity, I have great genes, my liver's always been great, anything like that. Whether they had HIV or not, the answers were all about family or religion or spirituality or luck or mission in life, any number of things, but nobody, and these are, often very, very logical people, but nobody comes back with a medical explanation. It's always something else. I thought that was really interesting.
So I want to let you know that I'm through 4 of my questions, so you should be drinking. Go ahead, Kathy, you want to jump
I have a
in?
question. Rebecca, so all these interviews that you did you record them?
I recorded a lot of them, not all. I recorded the ones that I had permission to record, and in quite a few cases, people were incredibly trusting with me, but especially in cases where they hadn't known me previously, they're going on the faith that, their friend said, hey, trust me, she's cool, can you talk to her? And it was really interesting. Some people were fine meeting in public. Other people did not want to be talking about this in Starbucks, and would then instead invite me to their home which was very trusting of me, but not of the world. I thought that was interesting. Some people were fine being recorded, but not quoted. Others were fine, saying if you ever do nonfiction and need to quote me on anything, I'm on the record. Some people said, I'll talk to you, but just please only take notes. So I do, I have recordings. I have many of them transcribed. I managed to get an intern one summer, like a lovely grad student who needed a course credit, and just made him transcribe all of my interviews. I also made him make me, I shouldn't say made, so I had him.
Make your breakfast.
Yeah, totally.
Bring coffee to my day.
Totally. I had him make me a map, like an interactive electronic map of every gay bar in Chicago in January 1986. So I could see where everything had been, and it was pretty amazing. This guy got a, straight guy, got a crash course on this stuff.
My follow-up on that question is, are you planning to do anything with all that research? It sounds so interesting. It seems like something that people would want to.
I hope so. I feel like what I really need to be doing, there might be in my future an essay where I'm kind of revisiting some of the most interesting things people said to me, and just putting it together as a little bit of a oral history piece, back and forth between all different speakers. Ultimately, I'd love to be able to hand those off to somebody who's doing more of a full-on nonfiction project about Chicago, because it frustrated me. I'm a fiction writer. I was at no point qualified to go, never mind, I'm going to write nonfiction here. But as I was writing it, I was, appalled that there wasn't more nonfiction out there. There are certain things, online. The Windy City Times, that same newspaper that I read every issue of, has done some really good online archiving, getting oral histories from people. But it's not to this extent, where I have a 2-hour-long interview with this woman who was a charge nurse on the AIDS unit at Illinois Masonic Hospital. That's an amazing thing that I need to preserve in some way. I'm not sure what it's going to be yet. But it's been one of the most amazing things to me has been some of the response within Chicago with other artists and other writers talking about stepping in and starting to document. And this is not completely related, but there's a photographer, it's actually the photographer who did my headshot, wrote me the other night and has been inspired. This is a part of the book has to do with a photographer who has documented the AIDS crisis in the 80s and is then doing some later portraits of some of those survivors. And she's basically wanting to start doing that in real life, to find men in Chicago who have survived and to do their portraits now. And wants to call it the Julian Project, which is after this character in the book. So I just I'm hoping very much that there will be other people stepping in that I can hand these off to, who can do things with them that I might not be able to do. I don't know. Yeah.
I obviously haven't read the book yet, but I'm wondering, what was your aim in connecting the story of the women in Paris with the AIDS epidemic and the people that you talked with? How did that weave in, and why did those seem like a natural fit?
Yeah, why the connection between Paris and Chicago? Besides, I saw those parallels and really just wanted to draw attention to them. I think I was struck more and more as I researched by the way that AIDS was a war. The way that particularly ACT UP and other organizations got out there in the street and were fighting. They were waging, actual tactical battles, risking their lives, being out there in the street. And there's a chapter near the end of the book about this major ACT UP demonstration in Chicago in 1990 that I was incredibly inspired by, in part because there's video cam YouTube footage of it online that I was able to watch. You really feel like you're there seeing this. I feel like this is a war novel. And I feel like we need to be looking back on the crest of the American AIDS crisis and the battles that were fought as a war, and we need to be studying it, maybe not as a war, but studying it with that gravity in school. We need to be teaching kids this, and it's barely taught. If you think about, you go to an American high school, you study World War II for maybe a couple weeks, and it's important to study. I'm not saying we should study this instead, but why do we study World War II? We study it to understand America as it was and as it is. We understand that chain of cause and effect. We study it because it's a major event in American history, and we study it so that this doesn't happen again. And those are the same reasons that we should be studying AIDS to that extent in public high school, in college American history classes. I understand part of the problem is you take American history and it's always that you get to the end of the year and it's and then there was Nixon and okay, have a good summer. So it might just be that we're not there's no time, but it's appalling to me as I've been talking about this book both before and after publication. People just too young. I was a kid when all this happened, but I was very aware of it in that kid way where it seemed like the most important thing that had ever happened. I think you get just 5-10 years younger than me, people who weren't as aware of it as it was going down, have been talking to me about having had no idea that it was something they'd heard of. That was we're almost back to the marginalization of this disease that was happening at the beginning of it for horrible political reasons, where it's something that's barely talked about, something that's barely acknowledged, and we're back there for certainly much better reasons in that it's no longer always fatal, it's under control in many ways, although in other ways it's not, but we can't just go back to that place of ignorance and marginalization on this. We have to keep talking about this because we have not learned the lessons that we need to learn. And so I totally left behind the Paris question and just went political again.
Okay, so I'm going to get pedestrian again. I want to bring it back down to language because I read the first 3 chapters of this book, and I've read your other stuff, and I've liked your other stuff. I think I was like a Facebook fan of yours 5 years ago or something. And the prose in this was so much more muscular and authoritative that I went back to The Borrower to see, was I mistaken? And I really liked The Borrower, and it's no, this is next level stuff. And I'm wondering if you were aware of it when you were writing it, or if you just felt can you talk about, a lot of what you've been talking about so far has been intellectual, okay? And I'm thinking that, in fact, when you sat down with that charge nurse for 2 hours, that you might have had a list of questions, but it was not an intellectual experience, it was an emotional experience, right? So, and I think of voice as something that occurs only partly in intellect, and a lot it's about a personality within the story that emerges. So can you talk about the voice in this and how you found it and that language? You're surprised to hear me call it authoritative and muscular compared to other work?
I guess I just haven't, nobody's been asking me about language. Because there's so much else to talk about. I think that's
okay. Sorry.
No, it's cool. I'm really happy.
Paris, this Paris language.
No, I'm really happy to get a question that I haven't been getting before. It's always fun. No, I think that voice is something. I think for every writer, and I imagine this would cross into other artistic disciplines as well. There are certain things that you do on intuition, and certain things that you really have to sweat out and think about. And I know that for every writer that's different. I teach enough writing to know that there are certain, I have students for whom character just could come in their sleep, but they really have to sweat out plot, and other students for whom it's the exact opposite. There are certain things that are just fuzzy and you just do them and you get them, and other things that you sit there and you analyze because that's the only way you can get there. Voice for me is always more on the intuitive level. It's not something that I sit down and make craft decisions about necessarily. There are a couple exceptions there. Maybe I'll talk about one thing that I know that I did. Whereas plot, although I love plot, is something I have to think about intellectually, to map it out. So I'll say one thing, and this might be just a slight tangent off that, but one question I'm always asking myself, this is super nerdy, as I write or as I'm working with my students, we're always, in fiction, you're always thinking about the point of view, right? Who's telling the story. I'm really obsessed with the flip side of that, which is what's the ear of the story? Who's the person listening? And specifically, what are we presumed to know or not know? So you could have a story that starts with there were a lot of people gathered in the back room of the Marquis Theater. It was July, it was the town of Middlebury, they were listening to this thing, and I'm kind of filling you in because I'm assuming you don't know. Or I could just start right in and be like, their drinks were half empty. Becky stood in the doorway. And like, you're gonna catch on eventually, I'm gonna fill you in, but I'm talking to you like you know, right? And it's really interesting to look at, I think, different novels, different stories, and try to figure out, like, is the narrator talking to me like I already know? And if I know, what stuff do I know? It's not either or. Or are they filling me in? If they're filling me in, what are they filling me in on? Like, am I supposed to know the town, but not what the event is? Am I supposed to know, like, all these people, but not, and I had to really make a decision on that with these. And the decision, so this is very specific, this is something that I actually thought out, because it's different for the two. In Yale's sections, my main character in the 80s, the decision that I made, and I kind of felt my way there, and then at a certain point was like, I need to make this decision, was that you, as you're listening, are people who know Chicago. Doesn't mean you actually do, but I'm going to talk to you like you do. You know Chicago, and you know Boys Town. Boys Town is exactly what it sounds like in Chicago. You know the bars, you know all that stuff. You know the newspapers, you know the restaurants. You just don't know these people. So when I introduce a person, I'm going to tell you about them. I'm going to fill you in on their background. But I don't need to fill you in on what the bar Cheeks is and what goes on there. I'm just going to talk to you like, you're going to figure it out pretty fast, probably because of the name Cheeks, right? So whereas in the 2015 sections, we have this character Fiona, and we really haven't talked about her much, but it's her brother who's died at the very beginning of the book. It's his memorial service. It's 2015. In her case, we're being talked to like we know everything that she knows. We're never being told really who anyone is that she already knows. And that was very strategic. It was a way for me not to have to fill you in on everything that's happened until I'm ready to. Because I don't, otherwise I give away everything that happened in the 80s. So when she thinks back about her friend Gail, I'm not going to tell you what happened to him. Because she's not thinking it because she already knows. I don't know if that made any sense at all, but that's okay. So,
Well, the other thing that happens is I noticed in the Yale sections there are a lot of jokes, and people will tell each other jokes. And then in the Fiona section, there's a time when a guy tells a joke, and I read it and I thought, oh, that's not that funny. And the next person says like, well, that's not that funny. I love this narrator. I love this voice. Yes, ma'am.
Did you have a favorite character in the book?
yeah. I really have, you have to, love your main characters very, very much. And I really specifically loved Yale very much. Beyond that, though, this is a very well-populated novel. Because it's about a group of friends, I really had to have a lot of people in there. And there's certain characters who I think I had I'm always interested in who do I have a disproportionate fondness for, like in relation to how often they appear in the book. And there is a character, Julian, who I was just mentioning this person's interested in naming this photography project after. He's just kind of a ditz in the 80s at least, and well, that's all I should say about it. But I just kind of loved him as soon as he showed up. I think Fiona, my character in 2015, I originally wasn't writing those sections. I was originally keeping it in the 80s, and I was about halfway in when I decided to add those. She had been a minor character in the 80s sections, but I really liked her. She's, again, just someone who showed up and was kind of all over the place and, in over her head, drinking too much, trying to do too much, trying to grow up too fast. And I liked her enough that when I needed to go in and weave some contemporary sections in there, I'm calling 2015 contemporary, although it feels like a million years ago now. But it was contemporary when I wrote it. That she was the one that I really felt like I want to know more about her.
I think there are two others that you loved.
Tell me.
From the reading. Well, you loved Nicolette.
Yeah. There's a
Can you
little girl.
And she's just got a cameo, but she crushes it. She's really, really good. And there's also a monster that you like a lot, Frank. I think there was a point where Frank was I hated him so much, I was like, oh, she's really having fun with this guy. He's such a monster.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Frank brings up is there is, as you were saying, it was a different culture and time. there is a very casual homophobia that they encounter. And sometimes it's things being shouted. And it's very interesting to see two men in a loving moment where there's so much going on with them, and then have somebody across the street shout an obscenity at them. Or, and there's even some small acts of violence,
Yeah.
right? And can you tell me about, I mean, how far do you go with that violence? How much do you make it not straw men or cartoon people, but a manifestation of how people thought at that time?
Yeah, it was really important to me as I wrote that there not be any one character who was the villain of the story, because AIDS was the villain. And I didn't, on top of it, need people to come in and mess up everyone's lives. And it has some people who are obstructive in some ways, like Frank, like, you know, but they're not completely central to the plot. There are, you know, certainly some characters, you know, you might want to slap who are being terrible. But then when much of, not all of, when much of the homophobia comes about, it's not from really my characters, it's from these very peripheral people. It seems almost like a part of the city. There's someone early on who's beaten up by people he doesn't even see. He doesn't know who has attacked him. Something happens to Yale and a friend later on, just something's thrown at them. It's not someone we're ever going to see again. And although there is at least one, I guess, you know, real actual homophobic character, it was important to me that it be part of the background. This is just the city, this is the time, this is where people live. It's part of the setting, the homophobia is. That was interesting for me. It allowed me, I think, to take my characters who do make mistakes, and instead of making them villains in some way, to try to get behind what they were doing. You know, I think an argument in fiction is always a fictional argument is most compelling when both people are right. It's not very interesting to watch an argument where one person is right and one person is wrong. When they're both right, I find that fascinating. And I could do that. You know, certainly you're able, you know, I think from the perspective of history, times when we can look back and say, no, like I'm going to side with this person, but it was important to me to understand where both sides were coming from in these arguments. Or, you know, when someone commits some act of betrayal, that I completely understand why he did that, and that the reader would completely understand that too.
So if you think about, I mean, I think that's part of the value of the 2015 section too, is that you see the ramifications. There's an awful lot of how did this all turn out? And there's a lot that's surprising about that. If you think about the book in whole, are there particular parts that you're especially proud of, or that you think like, well, this was difficult, but I nailed it in this way, or something that's like a favorite passage for you?
Yeah, well, I know you're going to ask me to read a passage, so we'll do that in a second. You know, there are, I think honestly, and these are not the things that I'm going to tend to read when I read from it, but there are always sections that the sections that I enjoy most looking back are the funny ones, actually. Where they're having Thanksgiving dinner and they're just joking around, and you know, the places where I feel like I got character right. They're not necessarily the sort of showpiece moments of the book, but the smaller moments. I think that character is something that actually I think I've struggled with in the past. I haven't completely gotten to a point that I was happy with. And I feel like for me, my breakthroughs artistically on this book all had to do with character and the portrayal of character. And so there are these very small moments often that I'm very happy with. But
so would you give us a sample?
yeah, okay, so this is not a sample of that at all.
Okay.
It's a sample of something else. What I'm going to tell you here, though, the reason I'm going to read this one, besides the fact that it's short, is that there's a story that goes with this. And it's I think it's a passage that I like because it has a little bit to do with all that research and all that work that I did. I'm going to read it to you first, and then I'm going to tell you the story. But it's short. So what's going on here is that Fiona, the woman we knew in the 80s, but now it's 2015, she's 51 years old. She's in Paris to try to find her daughter, who's estranged from her. And she's staying with this guy who in the 80s we knew as the sort of amateur photographer But by 2015, he's world famous. He's about to have a career retrospective at the Pompidou, really famous for chronicling the AIDS epidemic. And when she first got there, he wanted to show her these photo albums just of his snapshots from back then, not his artistic work, but she wasn't really ready to look at them. And now she's alone, and she's ready to look at them. And the one thing you need to know before I read this is that her job in adult life is that she works at a resale shop that benefits AIDS housing. It's loosely based on a place in Chicago. Okay. There were probably 20 albums on the shelf, a fact Fiona hadn't absorbed that first day. Rows of black leather, brown leather, colored canvas. Boxes full of slides as well, but she wouldn't mess with those. When she pulled a thick red album off the shelf, though, a paper slipped out and landed on the floor. Fiona attempted to clutch the album closed before anything else fell, but she dropped the whole thing, and now there were papers everywhere. Cream-colored sheets folded in half, small cards, a lavender page with a grainy photo of a man. They were funeral bulletins and prayer cards. She got on her knees and started stacking them up. This wasn't a photo album at all, she saw when she opened it to an old clipping from Out Loud Chicago, an obituary of someone who danced with the Alvin Ailey Theater. Jesus. She opened the album at the beginning and tried to slide the papers back into the empty spots. A man named Oscar, no one she remembered, had died in 1984. A clipping about Katsu Tatami from 1986. Here was the bulletin for Terrence Robinson, Nico's Terrence. How odd. She must have put this bulletin together herself, but she didn't remember it. Jonathan Byrd, Dwight Sumner. There were so many of them, so impossibly many. In her current life, it happened at least once a week that someone would wander into the store. And then, when they discovered its mission, say something like, "Oh, I remember that time." Fiona had learned to check her temper, to push her toes into the floor so her face didn't change. "I knew someone whose cousin had it," they'd continue. "Did you ever see Philadelphia?" And they'd shake their heads in dismay. And how could she answer? They meant well, all of them. How could she explain that this city was a graveyard? That they were walking every day through streets where there had been a Holocaust, a mass murder of neglect and antipathy? That when they stepped through a pocket of cold air, didn't they understand it was a ghost? It was a boy the world had spat out. Here in her hand, a stack of ghosts. And so the story I'll tell you is that, probably should have read something funny, right? But the story I'll tell you is that the interview that I was just the most kind of awesomely wigged out about was I'd had a photo on as the wallpaper on my laptop for several years as I wrote the book. And it was this beautiful photo of these 5 men, black and white photo, 5 men outside at a candlelight vigil right before this big ACT UP demo in 1990. And their faces are just illuminated by candles. And it's the most incredible photo. And I had been for a while under the impression that all of the men in the photo had died, and then learned that one of them, this activist named Bill McMillan, was still alive. And he was also one of the people, for the few of you who've read this is a very real thing, the chapter that I've written about that 1990 demonstration. There's a certain point where, again, it's 5 men, although it's a different 5 men. The protest ends kind of in the Federal Plaza area downtown in Chicago, and these 5 men had gotten into the county building by going in straight drag, which meant they were wearing like Oxfords and ties. And then they got out onto this ledge above the front door, or one of the big doors, and ripped off their shirts to reveal Silence Equals Death t-shirts. And then they unfurled this banner that says, "We demand equal health care now." And they're leading the chants, and there are thousands of people in the streets, cheering them on. And then one by one, they're violently dragged back in through this window. And you can see the footage of this on YouTube. It's absolutely amazing. And I'd written about this, and Bill McMillan, this same guy, was one of those guys on the ledge. So I actually got to sit down and meet with him. And I've been reading about this guy and watching this, and I felt like I was, meeting someone who I'd been reading, I felt like, meeting the Marquis de Lafayette or something, like, I can't believe you're real and you're sitting here talking to me. And And so we met in a restaurant, and we were sort of in a corner booth, and he brought all these photo albums with him, and scrapbooks and things, and this exact thing happened. He opened what he thought was a photo album, and it was just these funeral bulletins just fell everywhere. And I spent about 20 minutes helping him sort them out and trying to get them back into order by the date. And all these, he'd been, I think, originally from Milwaukee, and I won't go into it. I can tell people later it's super depressing, but Milwaukee has a very specific story with the AIDS epidemic that was very, very tragic and unique to Milwaukee. And he had all these ones from Milwaukee where they were all within a couple of weeks of each other. And it just, I just, that was, I always told people when I sat down to meet with them, I have my characters, I have my stories. I'm not going to, use your friend's story. You don't need to worry about that. But as you read the book, you might recognize a detail and say, that's something I gave her. Bill told me he doesn't read. He's very sweet. He's a hairdresser. It's like a hairdresser. He became this incredible activist. Went back to being a hairdresser. He was like, I don't really read, but whatever. So he's never going to read that in there. But, anyway, it's a sweetheart. So.
There's a certain parasitism, when you're doing research, I think, because you're not looking for history. You're actually looking for the human part.
Yeah.
I was saying earlier, a couple of books ago, there was a guy who was coming back from a third deployment in Iraq, and I had read a lot about the shape that these guys were in, and I had interviewed this guy a couple of times, and the last time we met was at the farmhouse in Burlington, and then we're walking down Church Street, and he's going really slowly. I'm like, we're trying to get to the car. He's the one who said his meter was running, and he's doing this kind of wobbling walk, and I couldn't figure out what it was, and I just sort of stepped back. And what he was doing was checking the rooftops of every building on Church Street to make sure there wasn't a sniper up there.
Oh boy,
and it's
wow.
like, well, yeah, exactly. So it's like, so those bulletins drop out, and it's like you've just been handed, the
Yeah.
muse has just been given breakfast.
Yeah.
Other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes, please.
Would it be giving too much away to explain the title to something who hasn't read the book?
It would not be giving that away. It sounds like someone else has the same question. So the title, The Great Believers, basically, this is something that I found before I knew it was going to be about the AIDS epidemic specifically. I was really researching for this book that I thought I was going to write about 1920s Paris. And I was reading this wonderful book by Judith McCrell called Flappers, 6 Women of a Dangerous Generation. And it's basically, she takes 6 women. It's Zelda Fitzgerald and Tamarita Lempicka, the artist, all these different women. And she, in there, included this quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald about the lost generation. And the quote was, we were the great believers. And I was so interested in where that was coming from. You have Gertrude Stein saying you were all a lost generation, but then you have Fitzgerald saying we were the great believers. It seems so at odds with that. It comes, in fact, from this really obscure essay that he wrote that was published posthumously in Esquire, called My Generation, and I've used it as an epigraph, so I'm giving nothing because it's literally the first thing you read, so I will read it to you. But it fit more and more the more I thought about it. So the quote is, we were the great believers. I have never cared for any men as much as for those who felt the first springs when I did, and saw death ahead and were reprieved, and who now walk the long stormy summer. And that spoke to me so much about that core of aftermath and, having lost your compatriots, your generation. I feel like it's a wildly optimistic title to put on a book about AIDS, and I think it was a wildly optimistic thing for Fitzgerald to say about the lost generation. This title, I had the title before I had almost anything else in the book, and I think that it kept me, I had to justify that title in my writing, and I had to keep thinking about what these people do believe in against the odds, what are the hopes that they hold on to. So I think it made me write a more hopeful book in many ways than I otherwise would have. And then, of course, I'm joking that with the font and then the cover or whatever, I'm going to trick people. They're going to think it's a Bible study guide, and they're going to.
So really, my favorite book of the year so far. The most I've been moved. I've laughed out loud at this book, and I was really a mess at the end in the best way. So I encourage you to empty the table out there. It's really worth it. And how about a hand for our
Thank you.